à la conférence de Gianluca BRUNORI sur Sustainability Policies and the Restructuring of Rural Space Scenarios for 2050. Gianluca BRUNORI est professeur à l'Université de Pise, où il enseigne Food Policy et Bioeconomy. Il est également vice-président de la Société européenne de sociologie rurale et éditeur en chef du journal Agriculture and Food Economics. Je dois dire qu'il a dirigé, il a servi comme expert en nombreux panels, en particulier les panels SCAR. Il a dirigé de nombreux programmes européens. Aujourd'hui, il dirige un des plus gros programmes européens sur le rural qui s'appelle le programme DESIRA. Et finalement, les groupes avec lesquels il travaille ou qu'il dirige ou qu'il a dirigé s'intéressent avant toute chose aux questions des stratégies individuelles et collectives des petits fermiers, des petites fermes, également et travailler sur l'impact socio-économique des supply chains, ou alors sur le lien entre les initiatives collectives et individuelles au niveau rural. Évidemment, il a servi, comme certains d'entre vous doivent le savoir, d'advisor pour de nombreuses politiques européennes au niveau rural en particulier. Donc, Gianluca, the floor is yours now.
Okay, so I have the opportunity here to speak about something that I'm reflecting in these days. So what will happen to rural areas in the next future? As you know, this is not only my concern, because there is, let's say, a mandate to the existing Commissioner of Agriculture in the European Commission to explore a vision for future of rural areas. But I think that the timing is very important in this regard. And I will start from something that you in France know quite well. Also, we have some examples of it. What does the Gilets jaunes riots tell to us? In my view, it is striking that these riots started on the carbon tax initiative. So a green policy measures that was aimed at raising the price of the gasoline for everybody. But of course, in this case, it struck especially those who commute, so who use a car for working. And actually, these riots revealed a rurality that we tend to underestimate or to overlook. So there are rural people that work in the town. So are they rural or are they urban? Because they pass most of the time in the town, but at the same time, they live in rural areas. So I think that this is something symbolic of the reflection we should have in relation to rural areas. So how can we start this reflection of the future of rural areas? As I told you, there is this initiative to launch a consultation on the long-term vision for rural areas. And in the document that launches this vision, there is a reference to the processes, and the most relevant process is urbanization. So rural is, as usual, considered in terms of urbanization. And in this case, aging the population and peripheralization are considering the three trends affecting many rural areas. And as a consequence of this trend, there is an awareness of that rural people feels overlooked. And for this reason, the generation of this phenomena that we call rural populism and other type of phenomena that signal a detachment between rural and urban groups. So in order to try to see what future rural development and rural areas may have in the next years, I will address three big narratives that have emerged at different times, and they bring together different types of arguments: modernization, endogenous development, and neo-endogenous development. The first one is the most well-known. It refers among the authors to Arthur Lewis, and actually Arthur Lewis was considering a kind of a dual sector in which the sector of agriculture and rural areas was at a very low or even zero productivity because there was a surplus of manpower, labor power, and then the let's say the receipt for development was to industrialize in order to free some part of agriculture for this surplus of labor force and so increase its productivity. So if we let's say articulate this approach, we can say that rural development is urbanization. So the more rural areas take the industrial model, the more they modernize. And so the focus was on technological innovation and productivity. And for agriculture, there was this approach to specialization and integration into supply chains. In front of this narrative, the opposite direction, so an alternative approach, was instead related to what we call endogenous development. This, among the others, we have, for example, Jan Douwe van der Ploeg, who have let's say, divulgated this concept of endogenous development. What does it mean? The first thing is that it means distanciation from markets and technology. So if there is a trend dominating, there was an attempt to create a gap with markets. So avoiding to be absorbed by the market and by technology. And in doing this, rural population and especially farmers build a kind of resistance to modernization and build a rural identity. And the key aspect of this is related to what we call endogenous assets. So assets that are born from within, so that local people are more, let's say, easy to find. And in this narrative, the quality of life is, let's say, countered to monetary income, and quality is countered to quantity. But this endogenous development was heavily criticized because it either considered a kind of Arcadia in which everybody could live a green life without the constraints from the market, but at the same time was criticized to be unrealistic because in the end, any economic system needs some, let's say, market and technology. And so on this regard, building on the idea of born from within, so endogenous strengths, endogenous resources, the post-productive paradigm and let's say, post and neo-endogenous development paradigm took some of the parts of the endogenous development, but developing in, let's say, in a relational way. So again, from quantity to quality was one of the pillars, but at the same time, there is attention to the multiplicity of function of agriculture, and there is no rejection of the market, but an idea that economic exploitation of the function of agriculture should be done, even if not linked to material production. So in this case, there is a weight, a strong weight of symbolic components. The idea that a rural area can, let's say, gain in terms of image and reputation towards the rest of the world. And the countryside is considered a node of global networks. So it's not isolated, but it's seen as a node of global networks. And in this, let's say, the model for development is related to differentiated economies, territorial marketing, and to a certain extent, to a different idea of a competitive advantage. And the authors who have explored this kind of line of narrative is Terence Marsden, John Murdoch, Philip Lowe, and the others. But this is one of the first books, let's say, theorizing this kind of approach that has made a lot of followers. So after the neo-endogenous approach, now we know, and now it is recognized, for example, by OECD, that rural areas have a competitive advantages towards, in respect to urban areas, and it relates to ecosystem services, food and primary resources, and rural tourism. So rather than considering industrialization of the countryside, that in some cases still animates the plans of some regional governments, also the OECD start to think that rural areas, and especially the remote rural areas, should look at what it can be the real competitive advantage of these areas. But with the Green Deal, actually we are turning into a new phase, in my view, because as you know, the Green Deal pledges to get carbon neutrality by 2050, and agriculture should not be out of this objective, but there is some discussion, as you know. But also there are precise targets for agriculture. So organic farming, minimum 25% by 2030, pesticide 50% less by 2030, and fertilizers 20% less by 2030. And also protected areas, 30%. At this moment, they are 25%. So this means enlarging the part of protected areas, and 10% strictly protected. So the question is, how will the Green Deal affect rural areas? So it will need a revision of these models of thinking, of these narratives. I think that we need a new narrative that takes stock of the old narratives, maybe taking the good part of it and try to mix together some narrative to build a new narrative. And this new narrative, in my view, should be based on the links and the mutual interdependencies between urban areas and rural areas. Whereas In the endogenous development, the idea is to create a kind of let's say, detachment from the urban models and from the urban, let's say, relations. And the neo-endogenous model proposing an integration of rural areas with global networks, but detaching the links with the neighboring areas. In this approach, urban areas and rural areas are strictly interdependent with each other. On one side, because there is all the commuting, and as we said before, so there are a lot of people that feel themselves rural, but they work in urban areas. And not only work in urban areas, but they get their income in urban areas. So if we get a broader picture, in the end, we can see that rural areas, in much of the cases, they are dependent on urban areas. But also rural areas depend on service provision. There is investments and economic transaction, environmental goods and amenities, governance interaction, partnerships. So we can say that there are several things by which it is necessary a better integration. And with the Green Deal, we have example on how this integration may occur. So if we consider factors of performance or peripherality, we see that now access to centers of economic activity are key. So rural areas closer to cities or with better access to services in general perform better. So distance matter, and this is nothing new, of course. At the same time, the ESPON approaches have highlighted that there is also a spatial factor of development that is related to socio-economic integration. So when we consider rurality, we should consider these differences that distance make, and at the same time trying to see how it is possible to overcome the distance with other arrangements. So in the OECD, there is these three categories: rural inside functional urban areas, rural outside for functional urban areas but integrated, and rural remote. And for each of them, there are different, let's say, indications for possible rural development avenues. What are these pathways? What are these avenues in 2050? And this is the first attempt to try to make a vision of what would happen in 2050. And I have reflecting on two key drivers for 2050. The first key driver is state intervention. I think that there are a lot of signals that we are getting out of the neoliberal approach. The neoliberal approach that has also, let's say, strongly affected the European Union, based on budget constraints, free market, free trade, and let's say, if possible, generous but more or less generous welfare state. Actually, we are assisting at this moment at a change into the perspective. And I think that the coronavirus has really changed the way we think state intervention. We have the examples of China and other interventionist governments that make strict regulation. They open let's say, the taps of public spending. They redesign governance, and they establish different public-private patterns. So freedom of enterprise is, to a certain extent, put into discussion, for example, with the concept of corporate social responsibility. But on the other hand, another driver is the vitality of rural communities. So what does imply in terms of vitality is having, for example, strong capacity of innovation, but based on social innovation. So reorganizing in order to achieve a societal goal. And for this, social capital is necessary. Entrepreneurship, but also of a social nature, and also an attitude of openness or of closure. So it, depending on these two variables, the pathways of the rural areas. So in the hypothesis I have made, we have two axes, in which in one we have an axis high interventionism and weak interventionism, green liberalization, I would consider it. So in the high interventioning, all the components of the political system are strongly committed to achieve the goals. Whereas in the green liberalization, targets are achieved through regulation, constraint to spending, technology push, and business-friendly policies. So the hypothesis is that the business and the policy elites are willing anyway to achieve these goals. The problem is how. In one case, there is a high level of intervention, including public spending. In the other one, the intervention is mainly based to regulation and technology. And on the other side, and on the other axis, we have a strong rural community vitality. So rural communities are innovative, committed to change, and tend to cooperate. Whereas we have a weak rural community vitality, in which conservatism, closure, fragmentation, and also prevalence of lobbies or political patronage prevail. And this is the result of the mapping of possible futures. In the first axis, we have interventionist but low vitalities of local communities. And I have called this pathway managed renaturalization. So the awareness that with the weak rural community, something should be done in order to achieve anyway the environmental goals. And for example, in China, there are programs of concentration of land and also relocation of smaller rural communities. So there is a kind of project of social engineering. We have on the right, so high vitality of rural communities and interventionism. And in this case, I have I've identified a couple of pathways: smart villages, especially for remote areas, and multifunctional rurality for less remote areas. Then we have a scenario of green liberalization with high vitality of rural community. And in this case, we have global niches, food districts, and sustainable intensification. Whereas in the fourth quadrant, we have liberalization, but also low vitality of rural communities. And in this case, we have abandonment and land grabbing. I will try to illustrate in a very fast way these scenarios. The first one, multifunctional rurality, is related to achieved rural-urban integration. So labor market, services, and at the same time, a negotiated landscape management, effective welfare systems, coexistence between small farming and larger scale farming, stabilization of the role of part-time farming because it's related to commuting to a certain extent, value chain integration, but also diversification of agricultural activities. And in this case, internal markets are rising of importance, and especially there is an active role of the municipalities or of the regions to achieve territorialized food system as represented, for example, in a system of farmers' markets. But then in the situation of green liberalization, we may find several, but not all rural areas can have this characteristic of global niches. In this case, the competitive advantage of some rural areas, so ecosystem services, tourism, and food, are connected together in strong specialization, export-oriented, landscape management related specifically to attract tourists, vibrant small farm communities, attraction of artists and seasonal residents, but at the same time, the risk of gentrification that we also are seeing in some countries, especially in Italy, we see some of them. For example, this is the example of the cellar built by Renzo Piano in the southern Tuscany, in an area that it's very rural and quite remote, but actually this is create a symbol that attracts people, because you can see this cellar from the coast. It's a kind of archistar, so the symbolic capital of it gives value to the wine and to the region around. And this is an example of what is happening when we insert rural areas into global networks. But then liberalization can also bring to what we already see, so food districts, so in which there is integration of agriculture into value chains, growth of farm sites, and also capitalization, a stronger rural-urban integration, and to a certain extent territorialized the food system based on regional specialization. And then we may have, and there is a lot of discussion about the sustainable intensification. In this case, the ecological targets of the Green Deal may be achieved through integration of agriculture into global value chains, global growth of farm sites, farm capitalization, agricultural specialization, but at the same time, the agriculture risk to be, let's say, invaded by the urban sprawl. And in the end, smart villages. In this case, the key of development of this area is heavy digitalization and rethinking of services, of commerce, of government based on the opportunities that digitalization offer. And in this case, also infrastructure for mobility will be rethought, urban-rural partnerships. And in this case, let's say the challenge is to create vibrant communities considering and integrating different generations with relocalized food systems, affecting welfare systems, and the possibility of attraction of professionals that don't need to go day by day to the town. And as you know, this perspective, especially during COVID, is more and more discussed about the solution for revitalizing remote rural areas with a lot of attractiveness in terms of lifestyles and possibility of well-being. But then we have, and this is something that I think we should reflect upon, this scenario of managed renaturalization. This may emerge out of a strong interventionism and weak rural societies. In this case, this may be brought by administrative centralization. So in Italy, for example, we have 1,000 of small municipalities. So with inhabitants less than 2,000 or even less than 1,000. In this case, there is a discussion about recomposing bigger municipalities. In some cases, encourage people relocation, not forced as in China, but to a certain extent encouraged by, let's say, incentives, or encourage farm and forest consolidation. So growing of the size of the farm, and especially giving subsidies to these farms through carbon farming, forest management, and alternative energies, or with, for example, the establishment of natural parks. And then we have the worst scenario in which everything is left to the market. But in areas, marginal areas, this may bring to what I call land grabbing, giving that the land will be of increasing value for society and will give increasing functions. There will be a lot of attention on it, and there are already signals of it, especially in the Eastern Europe. So this may bring to concentration of land ownerships, specialization in intensive production or in biomass, alternative energies, integration into global value chains, but at the same time having rural depopulation, in some cases unmanaged rewildering, so abandonment and rewildering, and growing regional disparities. So in this case, we will have rural landscapes that in some cases start to appear in many regions of Europe. You may have noticed that, of course, I have a personal preference for some of this scenario, especially with the high interventionism and rural vitality. But I have the feeling that in some cases, also other scenarios may appear. And to tell the truth, I have the feeling that this scenario of land grabbing, if there is no clear direction on intervention of the state and rural vitality, may spread quite a lot. So just to conclude, I would like to put these points for discussion. So the first one is that a vision of rural areas needs a deeper reflection on the urban-rural links. And this means, for example, considering rural development not only in terms of agriculture and farmers, which is very important, of course, but also considering all the other parts. I have the feeling sometimes in some national debates, for example, in Italy, and also considering, let's say, sectorial debates, that, for example, internal areas debates and rural development debates are not the same debate. I think that these two aspects should be more and more considered, and I'm sure that your network is very much it will be the protagonist of this, because you have a clear understanding of the regional connections. The second aspect is that a new paradigm of state intervention needs working out. So if the neoliberal state is over, and I hope it is over, what is replacing it? Is that top-down intervention the right level of intervention, or the governance and the level of decentralization of the intervention should be rethought? What kind of urban-rural partnerships we should need? What kind of public spending, and how to give priority to public spending in this case? I think that this is a kind of discussion that with the economists we should start considering. But then there will be specific issues for agricultural economists. For example, how can ecosystem services become the pillar of value creation? So should we only rely on subsidies, or should we try to create a new economic value out of ecosystem services? I think that this debate is just at the beginning. But at as the last point, I think that lifestyles and well-being will be the new game changers of rural development, because as we have seen, with the residents and the work are not on the same place, we will have more and differentiated and diversified patterns of living and of working. And I think that digitalization will help us to understand how the restructuring of the activities in the space will occur. And then in this case, well-being and lifestyle will be a point of attraction of rural areas. But then in order to have an homogeneous approach, a strong capacity of the state of planning will be necessary. And with this, I will thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Gianluca, for this fascinating presentation, and also for all the things you have stated for the future. There are a lot of questions. I'm not sure we can address all the questions, but maybe we can take a few of them, because we have about 10 minutes, so maybe we can start. There is a huge question. It's the relation between your presentation for the future and the future of a cap impact on your scenarios. I think that's a big way you can try to elaborate something on that.
Yes, thank you very much, André, and thank you, Luc, for this question. Yes, I think that the next cap impact may have impact on all scenarios, but depending on how rural development schemes at national level will be applied, I have the feeling that they may serve very much the managed renaturalization scenario, or even the land grabbing scenario. Because if you consider that still a lot of money of common agricultural policy is given to large scale farms, and given that part of this money will be given to green schemes, so the idea of carbon farming, so something specialized on just storing carbon, will be captured by let's say, big players. So I have the feeling and the concern that if there is not a good capacity of rural community to plan alternative, let's say, pathways of development, this may be the easiest way to achieve the let's say, climate mitigation goals. But of course, the new cap is still a debate, a current debate. So I hope that also this may help to frame, at least at national level, the right pathway.
Okay, there are other questions. There are questions, for example, on the idea of which is the more likely of these scenarios, and maybe you can relate it to the so-called urban exodus, if it exists or if it could exist.
Yeah, actually, in building this scenario, I have tried to capture what is already existing. And so in the end, I think that future scenario will be anyway a mix of different pathways we have evidenced. Of course, what we have to see is the prevalence of one on the others. So we already see global niches. We already see some examples of multifunctional regions with a good integration of rural and urban areas. I think, for example, I've seen that there are some examples of in France, very interesting. Also because I think that there is a regulation that helps it. As far as I understand, for example, there is in France this regulation about a local territorialization of food systems. There is this aspect of rural-urban partnerships. So I think that there are some very interesting aspects. But of course, Europe is very wide, and I think it is important to have a comparative view of what is happening, and especially in Eastern Europe, there are patterns of development that are totally different from what we see in northern countries or in southern countries. So it is very important to see, to start again with the comparative approaches.
Okay, there are also questions about a possible contradiction between interventionism and local vitality. Could it hamper the local vitality in a way?
Yes, yes, definitely. And on this case, I was inspired by a recent article of The Economist speaking about the relocation of rural communities, because you may say that a rural community of, let's say, 300 inhabitants is not, let's say, sustainable anymore. But you have to explain to them if they feel to be, let's say, at home there, why should you relocate it? So I think that there will be a lot of tensions on it. And for sure, I would say that interventionism could be top-down interventionism or bottom-up interventionism. And definitely, I prefer the bottom-up approach, in which there is a kind of, let's say, co-management of the processes of change. In some cases, I would say, where abandonment is really very far away, and we have situations in the mountains of Italy where this situation are really advanced, something has to be done, because otherwise the risk is abandonment and let's say wildness, which is unmanagement. So we can see wild boars everywhere, destroying fields, etc. And this is not acceptable. I mean, it doesn't help to consider an ordered development.
If I can abuse of my position, I have one question on my own. That's a difficult question. because you spoke about the relation between your scenarios and the CAP, but the CAP is not the only European policy. There is also the so-called smart specialization and smart development policies, which applies now for one round again in Europe. So I would like to know if you find they are compatible with this smart specialization policy, which is really pushing hard now.
Yeah, no, thank you for this question, because I think that this is a key aspect. I see it as three different policies. One is smart specialization. The second is rural development. The third is inner areas. In Italy, we have three administrations for three different policies, and sometimes they don't talk to each other. So inner policies have started again a process of listening to the territories, but overlapping with existing actors and organizations. And this has created a kind of mismatch, because if you start again reading the territory without considering the old initiatives, in the end, you lose ground. What I think in terms of smart specialization is that sometimes smart specialization has had a sectoral basis in some cases. I'm not sure that this applies to all countries, but my experience in Italy is that they have started from the technology rather than the problem. Whereas I think that in order to achieve development, especially for inner areas, you should start from the problem and then applying technologies, because otherwise the risk is to fund, for example, all that regards artificial intelligence wherever it is, but you create specialization, sectoral specialization, whereas the strengths of many pathways of rural development are related to diversification. Or if you want to create a specialization, you should be strategic enough to consider all the alternatives.
Thank you very much, Gianluca. Now I think that time is over. So thank you for this fascinating presentation and the scenarios.